Good evening everyone, welcome to an Oz Cyclone Chasers update, the 12th of February 2013, and tonight we're going to talk about the month ahead. And the month ahead, while the first couple of weeks are looking pretty slack, the next couple of weeks after that are looking very, very active. Maybe not so much in week 3, but from week 4 and beyond, it's looking pretty good for us. So, let's get into this update. Whenever we discuss the next month ahead, our first and primary area of focus becomes this MJO. And in the past week, let's have a look at what the bombs say. The MJO has weakened and then strengthened again over Africa. That's pretty normal. It is now expected to quickly progress across the Indian Ocean this week and enter the Maritime Continent region, which is around the Australian region, next week sometime, probably around late next week. As the MJO moves across the Indian Ocean, the risk of tropical cyclone development will increase across the basin. This includes, and particularly, the area off the northwest Australian coastline, which we see temperatures of 30 degrees or over. So while we're seeing a suppressed time in terms of convective activity since about late January, we are going to get into a near normal pattern very shortly, probably starting late next week. However, how strong this burst is, there is still a lot of variance in the model guidance. That's basically everything the bomb is saying there. So we're not quite sure how strong it's going to be when it gets here. At this stage, it looks like it's going to be moderate strength, and the best thing about it is it looks like it's going to move slowly. If it moves slowly, it means the entire Australian region will see weeks instead of a few days where the cyclone potential increases and we see an increased chance of heavy rainfall for a prolonged period of time as opposed to a quick burst for a week. So if we look today compared to last week in our update, we can see already there's starting to see an increase in thunderstorm activity across the northwest, but really nothing over the open ocean that resembles a monsoonal type trough. Still, the Coral Sea remains void of any cloud, and most of Queensland remains void of much thunderstorm activity, except for a trough line in through the central parts of Australia, creating some thunderstorm activity. Really, our focus isn't the next week, folks. Our focus becomes the week after that, then the week after that, and possibly even further into March, because that's the time where we're looking at tropical cyclone development, initially in this region, then in this region, and this region, and then in the Queensland area coming into early to mid-March. So, taking a look at the next 4 days of rainfall, once again, look, this isn't our real focus, but it's good to know. We're starting to see some good shower activity along the wet tropics coastline here, 50 to 100 millimetres over the next 4 days. We're seeing some really good storm activity, and I just showed that to you on satellite out here over the northwest. Not really extending too far into the Pilbara, but the Kimberley and the northwest parts of the top end, or western coast of the top end, is looking at some really good storm activity over the next 4 days, 25 to 50 mils over most parts, even 50 to 100 in some parts. The next 4 days after that become even more active over the wet tropics coast of Queensland, where we start to see even the potential for 200 or 300 millimetres out here in between Cairns and Townsville in the most preferred areas of the coastline. We also start to see an increase in activity around the Gulf country. We still see that northwestern part of Australia becoming active, but even more so, of greater importance, is the fact that we're starting to now see the Southeast Indian Ocean becoming more active as well, with more rainfall, more convective activity developing in this region in the next 4 days. So over the next 8 days, we see that overall we've got falls of 100 plus millimetres over most of the coast here of the western top end and the Kimberley. We've got falls of up to 300 to 400 millimetres over the next week between Cairns and Townsville, which is quite good rainfall even for this time of year where we expect some pretty good rainfall. That's still really good rainfall over a week, and then grading a lot lower than that as we head further south on the coastline. We're also starting to see some better thunderstorm, better convective activity in here through the Gulf country, which to date has been really lacking in terms of this wet season, especially the southwestern Gulf. This region here has had bugger all rain throughout this entire wet season. So some better news for most of the area that has endured now the last 2 to 3 weeks of very little in the way of weather activity. Looking at the latest MJO forecast now, I know this is a little technical, so let me talk you through it. we're going to see this MJO, this green line is the ensemble mean, so over all the modelling, according to the Euro model, it's showing where and how strong the MJO is at various times of the day. Each black dot represents a new day. So on the 10th of February, it was in here over Africa. On the 11th, it's already into the Indian Ocean. Look at how fast it moves across the Indian Ocean and into the Australasian region here between the 11th and 25th of February. So by the end of the month, this thing is well and truly over the maritime continent. So Australia should be well and truly feeling the effects of this MJO. And look, overall, it's going to stay pretty moderate. Now, if you remember where Oswald was when it developed, we saw this MJO really peak around about its time of development. Around about just before the time of its development, it peaked, and it was really strong in Phase 6. Now, with this MJO, it's still going to be moderate, even in Phase 4 and 5, as it gets into Australia. So we're going to see some really good shower and storm activity, some good convective activity, and some very positive signs for cyclone development around the later part of the month, and more importantly, once it gets into Phase 5 and Phase 6, into early March. We can see the guidance from the European model isn't all too different either, so there's a fairly high degree of confidence at the moment, at least until the end of February, of what this MJO is going to do. It'll be very interesting to see if the model guidance continues to show a small variability like it does at the moment. You can see very few models put their little yellow lines back into this circle, which means very few models expect the MJO to be very weak when it gets to Australia. Most of the models expect it to be moderate strength. Some of the models are even tipping that it might be stronger than the last one. So there is a little bit of variability, but overall we're tipping a fairly moderate pulse of the MJO to come through, which is a really good sign, as I say, for prolonged. And notice here that the dots become closer together in terms of spacing, so the MJO actually slows as it gets into Australia, which is fantastic news for those places who are really, really hungry for some rainfall. Problem might be you might get too much rainfall over too long a period of time. Here's a model projection using the UK MOGREPS ensemble, and we can see here the UK model being the second most accurate. They're very, very similar, aren't they? If you notice the different phase diagrams from both, they're going for a very quick progression across the Indian Ocean and straight into Australia late in the month. So expect to see a fairly rapid increase in rainfall and definitely cyclone potential towards the end of the month. Look at this by Phase 5 by the end of the month. And once again, fairly good model agreement that we're going to be at least seeing a moderate pulse of the MJO, maybe even stronger than the last one according to the UK Met as well. So we have fairly good confidence here up until the end of February that there's going to be a fairly decent push of this MJO, a fairly decent re-emergence of the monsoon trough by the end of the month. And look at this, by day 10, which is Friday the 22nd of February, there's already modelling that's picking up this increase in speed of this MJO and pushing it straight towards Australia. And this is the European ensemble. By day 10, we're already starting to look at cyclone potential off the Kimberley coastline to the north of well north of the Pilbara coastline here in this area bounded by the 1004 hectopascal region. So we're already starting to see that increased potential coming in a lot earlier than we sort of expected. We sort of expected this in the last few days of February. Some of the modelling is now suggesting it might come in a little bit earlier. So that being the case, we might start issuing two times a week updates from us, because that region will start to fire probably a little earlier than we expected. We sort of expected, as I say, last couple of days of Feb, maybe early March. So at the moment we're expecting that maybe even up to a week earlier than that. So it's just also variable because of the MJO. If the MJO pushes in a little bit slower, this region won't fire until, as we expected earlier, later in February and early into March. Look, overall, Queensland's staying reasonably inactive until early to mid-March, but once early to mid-March comes along and that MJO stalls right over the top of this region, we could be looking at prolonged cyclone potential throughout the entire part of Australia, including the Queensland coastline and obviously the top end coastline as well, and the Gulf country. So let's have a look at what we expect to happen in what weeks today. My apologies there, folks. I just jumped the gun a little bit. Firstly, let's have a look at the sea surface temperature anomalies before we discuss why models are predicting such a high potential for cyclone activity out here. Now, overall, look, the oceans are now warm enough anywhere to the north of Brisbane for a cyclone, anywhere to the north of Geraldton for a cyclone, but it gets a bit tricky here because of the ocean currents. But anywhere along the coastline north of Geraldton is going to be good enough or warm enough for a cyclone. You can see here some really warm anomalies. Now, this is the area of warmest ocean. So whenever modelling starts to look ahead and starts to merge an MJO with such high ocean temperatures, it is going to spin up cyclones, and it's going to suggest a very, very high chance of cyclone development. And so when I show you these week by week cyclone potential diagrams, I do want you to be very cautious with that, because sometimes the modelling overestimates, because of the high sea surface temperatures, the potential for cyclones. But needless to say, look, based on that, our real hotspot of activity is anywhere sort of from Darwin all the way through to Exmouth is our real hotspot for activity over the next month. It's not so much this week, not so much next week, maybe the week after, and definitely the week after that. Over the Coral Sea, that's not to say the Coral Sea is cold by any stretch of the imagination. The Coral Sea is doing everything it's supposed to. It's exactly as warm as we expect it to be, and there's even some parts near the Solomons here that are even warmer than normal as well. So it's just that the anomalies here aren't as high as the anomalies out here. So the modelling might be a little bit cooler than it should be in this region, where the probability might actually be higher than modelling suggests in the Queensland area, and it might be a little bit lower than modelling might suggest in the WA area. But overall, WA is going to be our hotspot. Folks, not going to spend too much time talking about this week. Absolutely no chance of a cyclone anywhere near Australia this week, and I'm pretty confident of that. So we're not even going to spend any more time talking about this week. Let's look at next week. Okay, folks, next week is the start of what could be a very active period of weather for Australia. Now, late next week, we expect a low to form here. There's a fairly high chance of that happening. Once again, we're only talking tropical lows. We can't tell you if a cyclone's going to happen. What we can tell you is a low, the chances of and the conditions for a tropical low to form in this area are going to be very good. Alright, so there's a fairly high, moderate to high probability of a low in this week. Chances are, based on the climatological norm, that it's going to push towards the west-southwest when it develops, alright, as it forms. Now, longer term, we just don't know. Now, remember, we're looking more towards the end of next week, and we're only looking at WA at the moment because Queensland looks to be quiet during that week. Now, let's fast forward to the week after. So not next week, but the week after. We are looking at either that low or a new low, pushing to the west-southwest, and there's a fairly high probability of that happening by that stage. And there's also a moderate to high chance that it will recurve towards the south or south-southeast mid to later that week. So we do start to see an increased chance of or potential cyclone crossing, or at least a low getting close to the coast over this western part of WA. That takes us through to very, very early in March. Now, if we focus our attention a little bit further to the east, we also see in that week a little bit of potential, or some low to moderate potential here, of a tropical low forming in the Gulf of Carpentaria. Remember, that MJO pushes pretty quick, and the eastern section of it is already well and truly in this region. So there could be a bit of a westerly wind burst coming through at around about that same time, probably a little later than the WA system, but certainly the potential for something to form here. At this stage, once again, only tropical low we're talking, and we're nowhere near sure of any sort of movement for this, but there is that potential later on in that week, ending the 2nd or 3rd of March. Folks, once we get into the 2nd week of March, really at the moment, the predictions are quite good for a very, very high potential of something forming anywhere in this red zone of either tropical cyclone or tropical lows forming in anywhere in this red zone. At way too early to discuss any sort of looking at which way it's going to form, but which way it's going to move, I should say, but really seeing a big increase in potential throughout this entire district, and look, even remaining fairly moderate to high potential for another tropical low or cyclone over WA, just on the basis of those massively warm sea surface temps plus the MJO loitering in the region for a prolonged period. Look, much will depend on how that MJO moves, but at the moment the models do have it very good consistency between model guidance of it stalling in the maritime continent or just to the east of us, and in that situation the entire parts of northern Australia are going to see above average or average rainfalls in March if that actually happens. Starting next week, we're going to see above average rainfall developing in the northwest, and then the week after we're going to see that extend through and even pushing a little bit inland. The week after that, we're going to see that rainfall still remaining high, particularly over north and now over Queensland, and then the week after that really focusing that rainfall on the northeastern parts of the continent. But if the MJO maintains its area of influence here over the maritime continent or just east of it, we'll even see the northwest still remaining reasonably active as well as the Queensland area. So look folks, good news is on the way. There is going to be a fair bit of rain on the way. There is going to be a fair bit of cyclone potential to go with it, particularly as we head into early to mid-March. First up, we've got to focus on this region. Secondly, we've got to start focusing in the Gulf. Thirdly, we're going to have to start focusing big time in the Coral Sea, the Gulf, and the Northwest as we head into mid-March. Alright folks, hope that makes it clearer. So good news on the way for most of Northern Australia. Thanks for watching. We'll have another update next week.